Your agency, the former agency, the CIA, has identified the geomagnetic storm problem. As you say, one manifestation of a larger family of threats as a black swan event that could literally, at some point in the next decade or two, end the existence of this nation. One of a handful of threats of that kind. I think you agree with that. What priority would you ask those who heed your advice to assign to fixing our vulnerability, whether it's from Iran or the sun or other sources?
Well, it's hard to have a higher priority because even nuclear war, which many of us spent some years trying to figure out how to deter and deal with and deploy weapons that could succeed in blocking enemy actions and so forth, even nuclear war is nowhere near what could happen as a result of an electromagnetic pulse, either a solar event of the sort that could well occurred back in the 1850s, and smaller ones have occurred since, but one the size of the so-called Carrington event back then really is absolutely and totally destructive of pretty much all the electronics anywhere. And so just for the storms, the solar storms, to ignore this when we haven't had a huge one for about 150 years, and they come about every 150 years on average, is sort of like being Dutch and saying, sea level rise? What's sea level rise? Why would we want to build dikes? You know,
Jim, can I ask you to elaborate? I think it would be helpful both for the audience and for the people watching to elaborate on what specifically happens in an EMP event in terms of in people's lives, what would happen as a direct consequence.
Well, the country has 18 critical infrastructures, food, water, etc. 17 of them depend on electricity. So if the electric grid goes, nothing else works. Briefly, yeah, maybe you've got some, you were out of the line of sight, and you've got a few days worth of propane or some way to store energy for a week or two at your home. But quite quickly, you find out that you can't get gasoline for your generator because the pumps at the neighborhood gas station don't work because they're on the electric grid. So food stops being delivered after a few days. Water, depending on how it's plugged in and connected, may shut down immediately. And by the way, all but one military base in the United States is on the grid. The exception is in California. There's one geothermal base that operates pretty much entirely on geothermal. Other than that, the electric grid takes down the military bases. Soldiers and sailors and Marines and airmen are as hungry and thirsty as the rest of us. We're used to saying, well, you know, there's at least this residual capability that can deal with this emergency and that emergency. Not with EMP. Because the transformers from this third type of pulse I described, the transformers are fried, and the whole grid just doesn't work. I think that it's something that of course no one's experienced it very briefly with power outages, but nobody has experienced anything like this in human history. And that's one of the things that makes it so hard for people to deal with. Very few of us like thinking about how to deal with something that is so horrible that it's just uncomfortable to cogitate about it and work on it. But we got to force ourselves to do that, or we leave the grid vulnerable to this type of total and complete breakdown. The 90% casualties, I think, are a perfectly reasonable assessment. Let me mention one other thing that people might not have thought of: anniversaries. Our enemies on the other side of the earth like anniversaries. And when this attack came against Metcalf on April 16th, that was the day of the Boston Marathon, but the marathon was moved a couple of days for various reasons, but 18th of April, of course, is the distinctive date. That was the beginning of the American Revolution, Lexington and Concord. It's a big holiday in Massachusetts, maybe not much in the rest of the country anymore. But you want to keep an eye on anniversaries because they like doing things to us on days that are important to us, they think, and ones that are symbolic to them. And you also, I completely agree with Senator Cruz's statement about the ridiculousness of saying Rouhani and the rest of these guys are moderates because they tweet or use Twitter or whatever. Remember when Andropov came to power as the head of the KGB, became head of the Soviet Union, general secretary? The press was absolutely jammed day after day after day with the fact that he drank scotch and liked to listen to jazz, and that meant he was a moderate. The head of the KGB ordered the Pope's assassination, on and moderate, because of the jazz and the scotch.